Imagine living alone in a remote cabin surrounded by dense woods and silence so profound it feels alive. For years, solitude was a comforting companion until one night, an eerie whistle shattered the stillness. What began as a single unsettling moment unraveled into a series of chilling encounters, revealing the cabin's dark, unexplainable secrets. This is the story of how an ordinary night turned into a confrontation with the unknown. "20-some years ago, I lived near the Canadian border in a rented log cabin. The cabin, part of an old fishing resort, had been renovated over the decades, but it carried an unmistakable air of age and isolation. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the closest town lay 15 miles beyond that. It was a life of solitude, one I'd grown used to, or so I thought. The cabin, nestled in a dense forest, exuded a stillness that could make even the bravest feel uneasy. At night, the world outside the walls became impenetrable, the trees cloaking everything in shadow. The only sounds were the rustling of branches and the occasional distant call of an owl. But on one particular night, something else joined the symphony. I had returned home from my shift at a resort 25 miles away. It was just after midnight, the kind of pitch-black darkness where you can feel the weight of the night pressing against your skin. Exhausted, I changed into my pajamas and decided to tackle the pile of dishes I'd left in the sink earlier. Standing at the sink, I looked out the window. The reflection of the kitchen light obscured the view of the forest, but I could still sense its presence, a looming blackness, silent and watchful. My cats, normally aloof, were unusually still, sitting by the wall as if waiting for something. As I stared into the void beyond the glass, the stillness shattered. From directly behind me, just above my head, came the unmistakable sound of a man's whistle. It was only 2 notes, but those notes pierced the quiet with a sharpness that made my blood run cold. For a moment, I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, and every hair on my body stood on end. The sound was close, too close, yet I hadn't heard anyone approach. Slowly, I forced myself to focus on the window's reflection, hoping, praying, I'd see nothing behind me. But the reflection revealed only the faint glow of the kitchen and the silhouettes of my 2 cats. They sat rigid, their eyes fixed on the air just behind me, their ears slightly tilted back as if straining to listen. My hands were still submerged in the warm, sudsy water, but I felt none of it. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to turn, to act. Slowly, without taking my eyes off the reflection, I wrapped my hand around a knife lying in the sink. It wasn't much, a paring knife, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing tethering me to the possibility of safety. With a deep breath, I turned. There was nothing there. The kitchen was exactly as it should have been, silent, empty, and utterly unremarkable. Yet the air felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. My cats remained transfixed, their gazes unwavering. It was as though they could see something I couldn't, something that lingered just out of reach. I backed against the counter, my hand gripping the knife so tightly it hurt. The silence in the room was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. For minutes that felt like hours, I stood there, waiting for something to happen, for the whistle to return, for a shadow to emerge, for anything. But nothing did. Eventually, I convinced myself to move, to check the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the snow outside, and no logical explanation for what I'd heard. But logic felt irrelevant. Something had been there, and it wasn't a person. At least, not in the traditional sense. That night, I didn't sleep. My cats curled up on the bed with me, something they rarely did, and I kept the knife within reach. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wind, set my nerves on edge. I told myself it was my imagination, that the whistle was nothing more than a trick of the wind or a bird outside. But deep down, I knew better. In the weeks that followed, the cabin revealed more of its secrets. Shadows moved where no light fell, and objects would disappear only to reappear in places I hadn't been. At night, I would hear faint voices just beyond the tree line, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. Once, I woke to find the front door wide open, the snow outside untouched. Another time, a picture frame fell from the wall with no apparent cause, the glass shattering across the floor. Each event was small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture of something deeply unsettling. The cats grew increasingly restless, often staring at empty corners of the room or growling low in their throats. I began to dread coming home after my shifts, the once welcome sight of the cabin now filling me with unease. The final straw came one night when I awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. Gripping the same knife from the sink, I crept to the bedroom door and flung it open, dreading to find someone there. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, fading into silence as if retreating into the walls themselves. By dawn, I'd made my decision. I packed my belongings and left the cabin without looking back. Whatever lingered there could have it. I wanted no part of it anymore. Even now, decades later, I can still hear that whistle in my mind. 2 simple notes, yet they carried with them a sense of warning, of malice, of something that didn't belong in this world. I've lived in many isolated places since then, but none have felt as heavy, as alive, as that cabin in the woods. It's an experience that changed me, one that taught me just how fragile the barrier between the seen and unseen truly is, and how vulnerable we are when that barrier begins to slip.